Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. AI is not just another tool in the shed, it is a system dependency test. Most companies today are not actually blocked by model quality, the art of prompting, or even the high cost of licenses. They are held back by fragmented data, unclear ownership, and a decision flow that is fundamentally broken. This is not going to be a quick high-level overview, but rather a look at how your operating model behaves when AI is dropped into the mix. If you are building inside Microsoft 365, you need to understand why adoption stalls and what an AI-first approach actually requires. The biggest barrier you will face is usually the company design that existed long before the AI ever arrived. The real barrier is the operating model. Most organizations still talk about AI as if they are rolling out a standard piece of software. They buy the licenses, run a small pilot, train the staff, and then measure adoption while they wait for productivity to spike. That logic belongs to an earlier era of technology because it only works when a tool sits on top of the work instead of shaping it. When a tool starts interpreting, routing, and recommending how decisions are made, the old rollout strategy fails. This is exactly what AI does in a modern workflow. It does not just help people write emails or summarize meetings faster, but instead it leans heavily on the entire environment sitting underneath the interface. Your content model, your permission settings, and even your naming habits all become part of the engine. When leaders tell me that they rolled out Copilot but nobody is using it, I rarely look for a problem with the product itself. I usually find an operating model story that explains the failure. If you look closely, most companies are still optimized for an outdated kind of throughput based on reporting lines and functional handoffs. Knowledge stays trapped in people, folders, and messy Teams chats, which is a model that only survives because humans are manually stitching the pieces together. People compensate for the gaps because they know who to ask and which version of a file is probably the right one. They understand that the document in SharePoint isn't actually the final version, and they know the real answer is hidden in an old email thread or someone's head. While that kind of organization might look productive from the outside, it is structurally compensating every single hour of the day. AI changes that dynamic instantly. It does not join your company as a patient human participant that quietly adapts to your office ambiguity. It has no way of knowing that a file named final v7 really final is untrustworthy, and it doesn't care that someone's access was inherited 3 years ago for convenience. The tool works strictly with what the environment provides. This is a critical distinction because the technology is almost always ready before the organization is. That is the exact tension leaders are feeling right now, as the technology curve moves much faster than the organizational ability to absorb it. Microsoft keeps improving the interface and the admin controls, but the company underneath those tools still runs on fragmented truths and diffuse accountability. When that pressure builds, AI does not transform the company right away, but instead it reveals every misalignment that was already there. This is why so many early AI programs lead to a strange sense of confusion in the executive suite. On paper, the plan looks reasonable, with a strong platform and good sponsorship, yet trust begins to soften only a few weeks after the pilot starts. Usage flattens out and questions increase as people find themselves verifying results more often than they expected. Leaders then start asking if the AI is underperforming, and while that is sometimes true, the real issue is usually much more structural. The organization is being asked to produce a level of clarity it never had to formalize in the past. That is the real barrier to success. We aren't facing an intelligence shortage or a lack of features, but rather an operating model shortage. An AI-first organization is not just a company with a chatbot, but a place where information and authority are aligned enough for AI to participate safely. To make this work, you need clearer ownership and cleaner data relationships. You have to move away from tribal knowledge and hidden coordination toward explicit decision rights. From a system perspective, these steps are not optional extras, they are the foundation of the entire house. If that foundation is weak, AI will not quietly fail in the background where no one notices. It will expose those weaknesses in real time, right in front of your employees, inside the daily workflows where trust is either built or destroyed. Before we worry about better prompts or better agents, we have to be honest about the actual constraint. For most companies, the biggest AI problem is not technical readiness, it is structural readiness. Once you see the problem through that lens, the whole conversation changes. The question is no longer about how to deploy the software, but what kind of organization can actually absorb intelligence without scaling confusion. Why AI exposes rather than fixes. AI does not arrive as a repair layer for your business, but instead it acts as an amplification layer. That distinction matters more than most leadership teams realize, because many companies still assume that layering intelligence on top of messy work will somehow create order. They act as if better summarization or smarter retrieval will clean up ambiguity by itself, but that is not what actually happens in a live environment. Since AI works from the data it can see, a fragmented or poorly governed environment simply means the output gets faster without ever getting cleaner. And that creates a very specific kind of disappointment. People expected acceleration, But what they actually got was accelerated uncertainty. The answer might look polished even when the source is weak, and the summary sounds right, while the underlying files are in total conflict. Sometimes the recommendation is useful, yet nobody is sure if the access behind that data should have even existed in the first place. Frustration rises at the interface, but the root cause sits far below it. I keep saying this is not mainly an AI problem, it is a system outcome. This distinction is vital because many leaders are still asking why the AI is making mistakes, when the more useful question is about the conditions we are asking that AI to operate inside. Once you frame it correctly, you stop blaming the wrong layer of the technology stack. Take a typical Microsoft 365 environment as an example. You likely have SharePoint sites created years ago, Teams channels built around dead projects, and OneDrive files holding critical content that never became shared assets. Decisions live in email threads instead of documents. Permissions are inherited for convenience, and naming conventions vary by department, while version logic lives only in people's memories. When we place AI into that environment and expect consistency, it isn't just unrealistic from a system perspective, it's fragile. The model isn't inventing the disorder, it is simply surfacing it, and in some cases, it is surfacing that mess faster than your people can structurally absorb it. This is the contrarian point that many organizations miss. More intelligence on top of a weak structure does not automatically create value, and quite often it actually creates more volatility. Weak inputs travel faster, ambiguous outputs spread further, and questionable access becomes much more visible to everyone. Because conflicting interpretations get reproduced at machine speed, the experience can feel like AI made the organization less stable. But if you look closely, the AI didn't create that instability. It just removed the human buffering layer that had been hiding it for years. Your people were performing structural compensation by translating bad naming into meaning and routing around broken handoffs. They knew which folders to ignore and which people to trust, and while that compensation kept the system functioning, it was never going to scale. AI is finally forcing that truth into the open. When teams struggle with AI, it doesn't mean they are resisting change or lacking skills. Very often they are reacting rationally to an environment that does not produce confident outputs. If people feel the need to verify every single result, that is a trust signal, and if they return to manual workarounds, that is a design signal. People optimize for usable work rather than the architecture diagram, so if the formal environment creates friction, they will naturally route around it. Again, that isn't a rebellion, it is a system outcome. This is where AI becomes valuable as a diagnostic instrument. It doesn't fix a broken structure, but it exposes it in a way that leadership can no longer dismiss as anecdotal. Now, the gaps are measurable because search time, verification effort, and permission sprawl all become visible at once. AI changes what the organization can hide from itself, which is why it feels so disruptive before the big productivity gains show up. Once you understand that, your response has to change because you don't solve exposure with more enthusiasm. You solve it with a redesign that focuses on cleaner data, clearer authority, and stronger ownership. If the environment remains weak, the next wave of AI will not save you. It will only compound that weakness. The Copilot stall pattern. This is the moment most organizations recognize, even if they don't have a name for it yet. The rollout starts strong with interested leadership and a curious pilot group testing prompts in Teams, Outlook, and Word. There is real energy in the room because the initial value feels obvious when drafts appear quickly and meetings become easier to catch up on. In those first few weeks, that momentum creates a dangerous illusion. It makes the organization believe adoption is working, but the reality is that the exposure phase simply hasn't happened yet. Early pilots are forgiving because the user group is small, the use cases are controlled, and the people involved are usually more tolerant of rough edges. But somewhere between week 6 and week 12, the pattern shifts. Usage starts to flatten out, and the same people who were enthusiastic begin to use the tool much more selectively. Trust doesn't always drop dramatically enough to trigger an alarm, but it softens until people stop reaching for the AI first. They start checking the output more carefully before quietly returning to old habits for the work that actually matters. That is the stall, and most organizations misread it completely. They call it adoption fatigue or assume the novelty wore off, so they try to fix it with more prompting workshops. While training might help a little, the deeper issue is that the pilot has moved past interface excitement and into governance reality. Now the people inside the system are running into the actual shape of the tenant. They see conflicting files from SharePoint and inconsistent context across teams, which leads to answers grounded in documents that nobody actually trusts. They hit permission boundaries that make no business sense, or they see results that reveal the permission model is based on history rather than current responsibility. Confidence erodes because the environment became more visible, not because the tool got worse. In Microsoft 365, this happens fast because Copilot is grounding across the entire collaboration estate you've been building for years. Every inconsistency in SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive becomes part of the lived AI experience. A small rollout can survive on goodwill, but scale cannot. Once usage spreads, people begin to touch the messy middle of the organization, including the shared folders nobody owns and the legacy project spaces that were never cleaned up. The cost of fragmentation stops being abstract and becomes a daily operational drag. And I've seen this again and again where a company claims a rollout was technically successful even though business confidence failed to scale. When you look closely, the signals are always the same. People ask which source a result came from, and they hesitate before reusing any output. They choose to verify instead of act, trusting Copilot for low-risk drafting, but never for actual decision support. That last part is critical because it shows where maturity actually breaks. Most AI deployments do not fail at content generation, they fail at decision confidence. If the environment cannot support trusted judgment, the AI gets pushed back into convenience work, which is useful but certainly not transformational. The stall pattern is not a mystery of user behavior, but a structural checkpoint. It tells you the organization has reached the edge of what informal coordination can support. If leadership treats this as a motivation problem, they usually make things worse by pushing adoption harder into an environment that still produces doubt. That just creates structural compensation all over again through more messaging and more pressure. The underlying issue stays exactly where it was, in the content, the permissions, and the ownership gaps. If your Copilot rollout slows down after the early spike, don't just ask how to re-engage users, ask what that stall is revealing about your operating model. Once usage spreads, your people finally hit the real cost of fragmentation. The silo tax becomes visible. Most leaders already understand that fragmentation is expensive, but they rarely have to look at the full bill. Before AI entered the picture, these costs were spread across the workday in small, tolerable delays that felt like normal business. You see it when someone asks in Teams where the latest file is, or when a colleague spends 10 minutes checking SharePoint, Outlook, and various chat channels just to find one link. Someone eventually forwards an attachment because the original link can't be trusted, and then another person rebuilds a summary manually because the context is scattered across 3 different places. None of those moments look dramatic on their own, but when you zoom out, the cumulative impact is staggering. And this is where AI changes the visibility of that cost, because the same fragmented estate that people used to navigate manually now serves as the grounding layer for your large language models. The time loss, the duplication, and the general uncertainty that used to stay hidden inside the daily grind suddenly show up in the AI's output. The system starts reflecting back the exact mess it was built on, and that is what I call the silo tax. It isn't just about data being stored in different locations. It's about your business reality being split into competing versions. You find one truth in the document library, another in the meeting notes, and yet another buried in a mailbox or someone's personal OneDrive. This matters immensely now because AI depends entirely on the continuity of context to function. It needs a stable, predictable relationship between the source of information, its meaning, its ownership, and who has access to it. If that relationship is weak, the result you get is not intelligence, but rather a form of probabilistic confusion wrapped in very fluent language. This structural gap is why many organizations feel disappointed even when the AI seems technically capable of doing the work. The model can summarize, retrieve, and draft perfectly well, but if the content landscape underneath is fragmented, the value of those capabilities gets taxed at every single step. You see it in those simple, frustrating moments where a Copilot answer references a file nobody recognizes or a summary pulls from notes that were never meant to carry final authority. Even when a recommendation sounds plausible, the team still needs 10 minutes to confirm whether the underlying version is current, and that confirmation work is the tax. The organization was already paying this price, but AI finally makes the cost measurable. In Microsoft 365 environments, this becomes very concrete very fast because the tools themselves encourage different types of sprawl. Teams creates conversational sprawl, SharePoint creates document sprawl, and Exchange holds the hidden history of every decision. While each tool is useful on its own, the problem starts when the organization treats a storage location as if it equals operational meaning. A file being somewhere does not mean it is authoritative, just as a document being accessible does not mean it is trusted by the team. Even if a meeting summary exists, it doesn't mean the decision path is actually clear to those who need to follow it. So the real silo tax is not just the time spent searching, it is the time spent on interpretation, verification, and the inevitable escalations and corrections that follow. This shifts the executive conversation because inefficiency is no longer just a common people complaint, but a structural performance issue that limits throughput. Adding more tools or more dashboards will not reduce this tax, and even adding more AI won't help if the underlying fragmentation stays intact. In fact, for some organizations, more intelligence actually makes the tax feel worse because it raises expectations for speed. If leadership believes AI should make work instant, then every moment of human hesitation feels like underperformance, even though that hesitation is usually rational. People are pausing because the organization has not given them one trusted decision reality to work from. AI doesn't create this inefficiency, but it does make the hidden friction of the business measurable for the first time. Once it becomes measurable, leaders lose the luxury of pretending that collaboration friction is just a side effect of normal complexity. It isn't just complexity, it is an architectural cost, a business cost, and ultimately a trust cost. I've seen teams with strong people and great intent still move slowly, because every meaningful action has to begin with a reconstruction of the facts. They have to ask what was decided, which source counts, and which version is actually safe to use. That reconstruction work is what fragmented organizations have normalized over time, and AI exposes how much energy is burned just trying to rebuild a shared reality. When people say they want an AI-first organization, we need to be much more precise about what that requires. You do not become AI first by layering intelligence on top of silos. You get there when the cost of fragmentation goes down because truth is stable and ownership is clear. From data storage to data alignment. Once the silo tax becomes visible, the conversation usually turns towards storage, but that is often a distraction from the real issue. People start saying they need to centralize the files, build better repositories, or clean up the libraries, and while that might help, storage is not the same thing as alignment. This distinction is exactly where a lot of AI programs start to drift off course. Most organizations were built to store information rather than align meaning, making them very good at keeping documents somewhere, but much less effective at making them structurally usable. AI cares far more about how information is used for judgment and action than where it sits on a server. A file in SharePoint or a folder in Teams is not automatically aligned just because it has the right name. Alignment only starts when the business can answer a specific set of questions about its own knowledge. You have to know what a document is, who owns it, what decision it supports, and what other sources it depends on to be accurate. These are not storage questions. They are operating questions that define how the business actually functions. AI does not work from location alone, as it relies on context, relationships, and the confidence levels of the data it processes. It needs clear signals that help it separate reference material from rough drafts and authoritative sources from convenience copies that are floating around the system. Without those signals, everything starts looking equal to the machine, and that is exactly where the system breaks down. In many Microsoft 365 environments, information is abundant, but the alignment is incredibly weak. There are files, conversations, and presentations everywhere, but the links between them are thin and the ownership is often vague. When metadata is inconsistent and naming conventions are left to local teams, the organization ends up with plenty of content but no dependable context. This is why storing more information does not make the organization more intelligent, and in some cases, it actually makes the business less usable. From a system perspective, storage without alignment increases the surface area of your data without increasing the clarity of your insights. This becomes a massive hurdle in AI-first work because the true value of AI is helping the organization move with confidence. Confidence depends entirely on whether the underlying information environment has a structure the business can actually trust. When I talk about data alignment, I'm referring to common meaning, known ownership, and a stable relationship between content and decisions. You can have information spread across 5 different systems and still be perfectly aligned if people know which source governs which decision. Conversely, you can have everything in one single place and still be misaligned if nobody knows what is authoritative. This is why the idea of a single source of truth is so often misunderstood by leadership. They imagine one giant storage location, but the deeper requirement is actually one trusted decision reality that people can rely on. That reality can span multiple tools, but it cannot survive contradiction without some form of control. The design shift we need is a move away from an archive mindset and toward an operating context mindset. An archive is designed to keep everything for the sake of retention, while an operating context is designed to make meaning usable for the sake of action. AI needs that second approach to be effective, and this is where many organizations need to mature very quickly. For years, data strategy was treated as a back-office concern involving classification and metadata that was easy to postpone. Under the pressure of AI, those tasks move to the center of the business and stop being administrative hygiene. They become the core of your throughput design. If 2 teams use the same metric name differently, or if a critical file has no clear owner, those aren't just documentation issues. They are decision and trust issues that create structural risk for the entire enterprise. Before leaders ask whether they have enough data for AI, the better question is whether they have the aligned context required to make that data useful. Storing information is the easy part, but making it operationally coherent is the real work that determines success. Once you see that, the next failure point becomes obvious, because it isn't just about where the data sits. It is about what that data actually means to the people and the systems that have to use it. Data is not knowledge. This is where most conversations about AI tend to fall apart. You'll hear leaders say they have plenty of data, and while that's usually true, having data is not the same thing as having usable organizational knowledge. We need to be clear about the distinction, because data is simply what exists, but knowledge is what your people can actually trust, interpret, and act on. That gap matters more under an AI-driven model than it ever did before. Inside a typical Microsoft 365 environment, the sheer volume of information isn't the problem. You have documents, chats, emails, and recordings scattered everywhere, which means the organization is producing signals all day long. However, raw accumulation does not create a shared understanding, and if your context is weak, adding more data actually makes the knowledge problem worse. The reason for this is simple. AI retrieves from what already exists. It cannot invent a level of clarity that the organization never bothered to create in the first place. While it can synthesize patterns or connect fragments to surface an answer, those results will only be as strong as the source. If your files are inconsistent, poorly named, or detached from any real ownership, the AI will simply reflect that internal weakness back to you. I see many teams make the mistake of expecting AI to behave like a senior employee. But a senior staff member doesn't just access information, they interpret it through the lens of history, politics, and practical judgment. They know which specific file actually matters, which team has a habit of overstating their progress, and which numbers are still provisional. That is what real knowledge looks like in a business setting. It isn't just stored content, it's the lineage and meaning behind the data. When we confuse data with knowledge, we start to overestimate what AI can safely do in the daily flow of work. We fall into the trap of assuming that retrieval equals readiness or that a quick summarization is the same thing as true understanding. From a system perspective, these are entirely different layers of operation. A SharePoint library full of random files is not a knowledge base, and a Teams channel is not a formal decision record. Those digital spaces might contain useful signals, but unless you have shaped them into something coherent, the AI is just drawing from digital residue. This is exactly why naming discipline and source hierarchy are so important for structural resilience. If a forecast deck exists but nobody knows if the finance team still stands behind it, you have data without any dependable knowledge. The same problem occurs when 3 different departments use the same customer status label in 3 different ways. AI will reproduce that inconsistency with impressive fluency, which leads to what I call organizational hallucination. These are outputs that sound perfectly coherent because the language is smooth, even though the underlying business meaning is completely unstable. This becomes dangerous the moment AI starts influencing operational judgment. People aren't just reading content anymore, they are acting on interpreted content, and if your knowledge design is weak, you are essentially automating ambiguity. I believe leaders need to treat knowledge as a core business capability rather than a side effect of collaboration. It isn't something that magically appears once you accumulate enough content. Knowledge has to be designed by deciding what counts as authoritative and what requires human arbitration. This isn't glamorous work, but it has become performance critical because AI raises the value of well-shaped knowledge while simultaneously raising the cost of the messy stuff. Once you accept that reality, you realize that weak knowledge isn't just an annoyance, it's a real organizational exposure. Permission clarity is business design. For a lot of leadership teams, this is the point where the AI conversation stops being abstract and starts getting very real. Once AI starts grounding itself across your environment, your permission design becomes visible in a way you can't ignore. Before AI, weak permissions were often tolerated as a bit of administrative clutter that people told themselves was manageable. There were too many inherited rights and too many old sharing links because it was easier than deciding who should actually own a folder. But when AI enters the picture, those old convenience decisions quickly turn into operational exposure. It's important to remember that Copilot and other agents aren't inventing new access. They are simply surfacing what your environment already allows. If sensitive information pops up where it shouldn't, the AI didn't actually break a rule. The environment already contained a rule failure, and the AI just made that failure usable at a much higher speed. Many organizations still try to treat permissions as a technical cleanup task for the IT department, but that frame is far too narrow for an AI-first operating model. Permissions are more than just security settings. They are direct statements about business responsibility. They express exactly who is supposed to know what and who is expected to carry the risk for specific information. If your access model is a mess, it usually means your operating model is messy too, because oversharing is rarely a random occurrence. Usually it reflects years of unclear ownership and temporary exceptions that quietly became permanent over time. A project starts, a team gets broad access for the sake of speed, and then nobody bothers to remove those rights once the work is finished. From a system perspective, that isn't just an admin issue, it is accumulated business ambiguity that AI makes impossible to hide. This is particularly relevant inside Microsoft 365 because the environment is so highly connected by design. Between SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive, your digital estate becomes a map of old decisions layered on top of each other. That worked well enough when finding information depended on human effort, but it becomes a massive risk when retrieval becomes conversational. The gap between what is technically accessible and what is operationally appropriate is where trust starts to break down. If your people suspect the system can see too much, they will stop trusting the tools entirely. Likewise, if business leaders can't explain why certain data is reachable, they lose the confidence they need to scale these systems. Permission clarity is about making responsibility legible so everyone knows who has access and why they have it. That is a matter of business design, not just tenant hygiene. In the past, access and accountability could stay loosely connected, but in an AI environment, those two things cannot be separated for very long. If a team can retrieve data, someone has to be answerable for that data, and if an agent can act on content, someone must own the boundaries. Otherwise, you end up with speed without any real governance, and speed without governance is just another word for fragility. When I look at permission sprawl, I see old operating choices that are still living in the architecture. The fix isn't just to clean up the folders, it's to align your permissions with real current responsibility. Access should reflect your current business purpose and decision rights, rather than history or convenience. In an AI-first organization, every permission is a design decision about trust and authority, but even clean access won't help if nobody truly owns the outcome. From roles to responsibilities. And this is where we need to get much more precise about how accountability actually works. Most organizations still confuse their internal structure with actual ownership, which is a mistake that creates a massive single point of failure. They look at a standard org chart and assume responsibility is already clear because there is a head of this department or a director over that function, so the logic feels complete on paper. But under the pressure of AI, that illusion breaks apart very quickly. Titles only tell you where someone sits in the building, but they don't reliably tell you who is answerable when the output is wrong or the workflow needs a snap decision. That distinction matters more than people realize. A role describes a position, while a responsibility describes operational accountability, and your AI systems desperately need the second one to function. In traditional work environments, ambiguity around responsibility can survive much longer than you might think because human systems are full of compensating behavior. Someone eventually steps in to forward an email or says they think a task belongs to another team, and the work keeps moving in a slow and messy way. But once AI enters your workflow, that tolerance for vagueness completely drops. The system is now generating summaries and actions that depend on someone defining what counts as good or what counts as trusted. If nobody owns those specific conditions, the entire organization starts to drift into uncertainty. And why is that? It's because AI creates intense pressure at the seams of your business where the handoffs happen. You have to ask who owns the data source and who owns the prompt logic living inside the automated workflow. When an output conflicts with company policy, someone has to own that exception, just like someone must decide if an AI summary is safe to act on or just for information. These are not abstract governance questions for a board meeting, but daily execution questions that keep the gears turning. In many companies, the answers to these questions are surprisingly weak and rely on vague phrases. You will often hear people say that the business owns it or that IT manages the platform, but that is still far too vague for a high-performance system. Because the business is not a named human owner, IT is not accountable for the actual meaning of the work, and security cannot define operational truth for every single workflow. The result is diffuse accountability, where everyone is standing near the issue, but nobody is clearly carrying the weight of it. This lack of clarity is one of the main reasons AI adoption slows down after the initial excitement wears off. It isn't because the organization lacks good use cases, but because when uncertainty appears, there is no clean authority path to resolve the problem. People hesitate to move forward because nobody feels they have the power to authorize a change confidently. From a system perspective, that isn't a culture flaw first, it is a design flaw in your operating model. The old model assumes work can be coordinated through broad stakeholder groups and informal escalations, but AI needs defined surfaces to perform well. You need a named owner for the data asset, the workflow, the quality threshold, and the exception path. Now map that logic to your Microsoft 365 environment, and you will see the gap immediately. A SharePoint site might have an admin and a team might have an owner, but none of those technical roles mean someone owns the business consequence of what happens there. Technical administration is not the same thing as operational accountability, and if you miss that distinction, you end up with environments that are maintained but not truly owned. Every important asset now needs a clear human owner instead of a vague stakeholder circle. Every important workflow needs a person who can say, this is the trusted source, and this is the exact moment when a human must intervene. That is what responsibility looks like in an AI-first operating model because it is more explicit, more local, and much more actionable. The shift we are seeing is from role-based hierarchy to responsibility-based execution, which doesn't replace the org chart but finally makes it operational. If you cannot point to the specific person responsible for a decision surface, then AI will eventually expose that gap for you. Once ownership becomes unclear, the quality of your decisions starts to drift, and the system begins to fail. Clear ownership is the first control surface. So once we separate roles from responsibilities, the next step in the process becomes obvious. Ownership is the first real control surface of your organization, and it matters more than policy, training, or general enthusiasm. Ownership is the specific point where trust has somewhere to land. giving the organization a place to root uncertainty when things get complicated. It creates a hard boundary around what must be maintained and who is expected to act when the system breaks. Without that clear boundary, your governance stays theoretical and never actually touches the ground. This is why so many AI programs feel overgoverned on paper but completely under-controlled in reality. There are steering groups and review meetings and colorful diagrams, but when a real issue appears inside a workflow, nobody can answer the most important question. Who actually owns this outcome? If the answer is vague, then your control surface is missing entirely. This matters because AI outputs are fundamentally different from traditional software outputs since they are probabilistic and context sensitive. They depend on changing content and permissions, which means you cannot control them through static rules alone. You need operating accountability around them, where someone owns the source quality and the retrieval boundaries. Someone must own the workflow logic and the threshold between acceptable assistance and unacceptable risk. That is what makes ownership the first control surface, because it is where the organization turns uncertainty into direct action. I think many companies still rely way too much on group accountability, where a committee approves a direction and a working group discusses the issue. But groups do not correct a messy document library on a Tuesday morning, and they certainly don't resolve permission conflicts before a sales proposal goes out. People do that work, and they need to be named people. In practice, this ownership has to be more explicit than most organizations are used to seeing. The business owner should own the meaning of the workflow, while IT owns the platform reliability and security owns the protection boundaries. These roles are not overlapping in a vague way, but instead they need very explicit boundaries to function. If everyone is involved but nobody is clearly accountable, then every AI issue turns into a massive delay. People start checking sideways before they act, and they escalate issues too late or too often because they don't want to carry risk alone. That is why named ownership actually speeds up decisions instead of slowing them down like people fear. It reduces the need for constant negotiation and creates fast correction loops that give people confidence in the system. A lot of leaders hear the word ownership and think of control overhead, but I hear throughput design. Once ownership is clear, 3 things in your system will improve very quickly. First, your quality thresholds become real decisions about what is good enough to use. Second, exceptions become manageable because the system finally knows where ambiguity is supposed to go. Third, the overall trust improves because people know that errors can be handled by someone with the authority to fix them. That is the fundamental difference between ceremonial governance and operational governance. Ceremonial governance spends its time writing principles, but operational governance gives every critical asset a responsible owner. In an AI-first organization, that has to include the outputs just as much as the inputs. If an AI summary influences a major decision, someone must own the conditions under which that summary is acceptable. If an agent recommends an action, someone must own the authority boundaries around that recommendation. Ownership is the only thing that makes a scalable system possible. So before leaders ask if their AI governance model is mature, I think they should ask a much simpler question. Can we point to a named owner for every important data asset, workflow, and exception path? If the answer is no, then the organization does not have a real control surface yet. It has participation and discussion, but it does not have operational control. And now we can finally get to the structural center of the whole episode. Redesign decision rights around data. Now we've reached the actual structural center of this entire conversation. If ownership acts as your first control surface, then decision rights are the operating logic that makes that control usable. This is exactly where most organizations are currently under-designed. When AI enters your workflow, the vital question isn't just who owns the platform or the file anymore. The real question becomes much sharper. Who gets to decide? Which data are they using? What authority do they hold, and under what specific conditions? That is the redesign we need, and I'm not talking about more governance theater or another review board that meets once a month to look at spreadsheets. We need a practical redesign of decision rights built directly around your data. AI becomes truly valuable when it reduces ambiguity in human judgment, rather than just reducing the effort required for small tasks. If an organization has weak decision rights, AI won't accelerate judgment. It will only accelerate the confusion surrounding that judgment. Think about how this looks in a broken system. A recommendation appears on a screen, but nobody knows if it's advisory or binding. A summary is generated, yet nobody can tell if it's just helpful context or approved evidence for a final decision. When an agent flags an exception, the team doesn't know who can override it, who must review it, or who carries the consequence if that override fails. Performance breaks at the authority layer, not at the prompt. Most organizations still design work around a simple process flow of steps, approvals, and handoffs. AI pressures something much deeper than process because it exposes whether your authority is explicit or merely implied. Implied authority never scales well once machines start participating in the flow, so we have to make 4 specific things visible: input ownership, recommendation logic, approval authority, and override authority. Input ownership means a specific person is responsible for the data entering the decision in a real operational sense. They ensure the source is trusted, the metrics are current, and the documents are authoritative across the entire workflow. Recommendation logic means the organization actually understands what the AI is doing, whether it's ranking cases or flagging risks. If you can't explain the role of that recommendation, your team will never be able to calibrate their trust correctly. Approval authority requires a named person or function with the right to accept the output so the workflow can move forward. Override authority ensures there is a clear human right to intervene when the risk or ambiguity exceeds what the automated layer can handle. Without these four elements, you end up in an unstable middle state where humans assume the system is deciding while the system is only recommending. The workflow keeps moving anyway, and when something goes wrong, everyone discovers too late that authority was never actually defined. From a system perspective, that isn't maturity, it's just structural drift. Now map this to Microsoft 365 and the Power Platform. A Copilot-generated summary might inform an account decision, or a Power Automate flow might route approvals based on extracted content. All of that is useful, but that usefulness depends entirely on making your decision rights explicit. You have to know who trusts the source, who validates the recommendation pattern, and who can pause the entire thing if it goes off the rails. This isn't about adding governance overhead, it's about throughput design. Clear decision rights reduce waiting, duplicate checking, and those endless escalation loops where 5 people are included because no one is sure who is allowed to say yes. Decisions are slow today, not because people are careless, but because authority is distributed in a blurry way. More data won't fix that, and more dashboards won't fix it either. Explicit decision rights are the only solution. Once those rights are clear, AI becomes a participant inside a designed decision system rather than just a novelty tool. It can gather, compare, and route information while the organization remains clear about where human judgment starts and where overrides remain non-negotiable. That is what an AI-first operating model actually requires. If decision rights stay vague, AI will scale uncertainty faster than your business can absorb it. From processes to decision systems. Once decision rights become visible, we have to change how we think about the concept of process itself. Most organizations still manage work as if the main objective is just movement. Getting the request in, routing it, and closing the ticket. That is traditional process thinking, and while it helps standardize recurring work and reduce friction, it has a massive limitation. A process map shows how work moves, but it almost never shows how judgment moves. That difference is becoming critical because AI is fundamentally changing the cost structure of analysis. It can summarize, retrieve, and generate options faster than any human, which means the slowest part of your workflow is no longer the task layer. The bottleneck is now the judgment layer. We have to ask who decides, what evidence they need, and what happens when the system's confidence isn't high enough. I believe many organizations are optimizing the wrong layer by refining workflows when the real problem sits in decision design. A workflow diagram might show 5 steps and 3 approvals, but a true decision system asks what evidence is valid and what conditions trigger an escalation. Once you look through that lens, you see why so many AI initiatives create rework instead of flow. The output appears, but the decision path remains vague, so humans step back in to reconstruct their confidence manually. They ask for another opinion, they request another review, and they add another approver just to be safe. The organization feels busy and advanced, but structurally, it is still paralyzed by uncertainty. That uncertainty is expensive in terms of both time and trust. People inside the system learn very quickly whether a machine recommendation helps them decide or just creates one more thing they have to double check. If it creates more work, adoption will slow down. This isn't because your people are resistant to change, it's because your decision architecture is incomplete. In a Microsoft environment, a Power Automate flow might move a document beautifully while Copilot summarizes the content. If the receiving team still doesn't know if the source is authoritative or if they truly own the decision, the process moved, but the judgment stayed stuck. Process optimization without decision clarity simply speeds your work toward a dead end of uncertainty. From a system perspective, that is incredibly fragile, so leaders need to upgrade their unit of design from automated process to decision system. A real decision system is built around a defined decision point, a known evidence base, a named authority, and a clear threshold for action. You also need a learning loop for when the result turns out wrong. Decision systems improve when outcomes flow back into the logic of who decides and what evidence counts. AI-first organizations look different because they are better at making judgment legible. People know where a decision begins, they know which evidence matters, and they know exactly when a human must step in to take the lead. This clarity is what actually reduces rework and improves speed. It builds trust because it shortens hesitation, which is one of the biggest hidden performance drains in modern business. Hesitation isn't caused by a lack of effort or a lack of data. It's caused by vague judgment pathways. If you want faster decisions, the answer isn't more analytics, it's better decision architecture. Make your judgment explicit and your authority clear, and then AI will finally have something stable to participate in. Automation is not decision-making. This is the exact point where many organizations collapse two very different concepts into one. They successfully automate a manual step and then mistakenly assume they have designed a formal decision, but those two things are not the same. Automation is strictly about execution, while true decision-making is about accountable judgment. That distinction matters more under AI than it did in older workflow systems because modern outputs look intelligent enough to invite trust before the organization has actually earned that trust structurally. A flow can move a document, a model can classify a request, and an agent can suggest a next action. All of those capabilities save time and reduce friction, but none of them tell us whether the organization has designed a reliable judgment path. And why is that? It's because a decision is not just an action point, it is a commitment point that changes risk and allocates resources. It affects customers, revenue, compliance, and the people living inside the system. When we talk about decision making, we are talking about the right to convert information into a consequence. Automation can support that process, but it cannot replace the need to define who actually owns the consequence. This is why so many AI projects look successful in a demo, but feel incredibly fragile once they hit production. The task execution and the data extraction might work perfectly, but when the case becomes ambiguous or the context falls outside the happy path, the system reveals that nobody defined how much judgment was meant to stay human. That is the failure. The problem isn't that the automation existed, but rather that the judgment boundary did not. We need a much cleaner distinction between flow efficiency and decision integrity. Flow efficiency asks if the work can move faster, while decision integrity asks if it should move at all, on what basis it moves, and who is answerable if it moves wrongly. Those are very different questions, yet in most Microsoft environments, the first one gets all the attention. We build the Power Automate flow, connect the trigger, and summarize the input, and technically the system works. However, the business still hesitates because the real uncertainty was never in the movement of data. It was in the meaning of that data. Was the source complete? Was the recommendation reliable? And was the approver actually empowered to challenge the output? Over-automation and under-definition create the same structural fragility. In one case, the machine is doing too much, and in the other, the humans are doing too little design. Once you understand that, a better design principle starts to emerge. Automate repeatable steps, but design accountable judgment. This means routine, reversible work like drafting or routing can move through automation with strong guardrails. But high-impact or exception-heavy work needs calibrated human control. You need a named authority, a visible threshold, and a clear override path. That is what keeps a system resilient. The real risk is not the technology itself, but the act of pretending that execution logic and judgment logic are interchangeable. That's the external case, Zillow, and the limits of scale. Let's make this concrete with a case that many leaders already know. Zillow is a useful example because it helps us separate a technical success from a total operating model failure. The company used algorithmic pricing inside its iBuying business to estimate home values and scale purchase decisions. On paper, that sounds like exactly the kind of thing predictive systems should be good at, given the large volumes and the need for fast recommendations in a market where speed is everything. For a while, that logic looked compelling, but a predictive capability is not the same as an absorbable business capability. Even if the pricing logic works in most cases, the surrounding organization still has to absorb volatility and feedback at the speed the model creates. If that surrounding structure is weak, then algorithmic confidence becomes dangerous very quickly. That is what Zillow exposed to the market. The issue wasn't just that prediction is hard. The deeper problem was that the system accelerated decisions faster than the operating discipline could safely carry them. From a system perspective, this is a major warning. An AI initiative can work technically and still fail structurally. The model can generate usable outputs and the math can be sound, but if your exception handling and governance are too weak, then scale stops being a strength and becomes a force multiplier for fragility. Because once you accelerate decision inputs, you compress the time available for human judgment and risk absorption. You have less room for slow correction or local adaptation when reality stops matching the digital pattern. That compression is where a lot of leaders get caught. They think the system is failing because the model wasn't perfect, but no real business environment gives you perfect prediction. The actual question is whether the organization was designed to handle imperfect prediction under high speed. Most companies are far less ready for that than they think. In Zillow's case, the market volatility was just the test that proved the operating model lacked the structural resilience to respond when the model met conditions it couldn't absorb. Can the organization slow down intelligently or escalate exceptions early enough to matter? Can it challenge the recommendation path before the losses start to compound? If the answer is no, then the problem is much bigger than the algorithm. It is a decision system problem. Prediction is not the same thing as decision readiness. A model can tell you what is likely, but that does not mean the business is ready to act on that likelihood at scale. Decision readiness needs clear ownership, override authority, and feedback loops to detect when local exceptions are becoming systemic exposure. Without those things, the model is just a speed engine attached to a weak steering system. I'm not sharing the Zillow story to suggest you shouldn't use AI for high-value decisions. The real lesson is that if your organization cannot absorb the consequences of accelerated judgment, then accelerating that judgment is just structural overreach. Many current AI strategies focus too narrowly on whether the model can summarize or predict. Those are valid questions, but they are incomplete. The harder question is whether the business has designed the accountability and correction mechanisms needed to use that capability safely. Zillow is a clean example of technical capability moving faster than organizational absorption. Now, map that to your own environment. The stakes might look smaller, but the pattern of strong tools sitting on top of weak decision paths is exactly the same. The internal pattern, strong tools, weak design. Now map that same logic to what happens inside a Microsoft environment, because this is where the pattern becomes painfully familiar for most leaders. The tooling itself is almost never the weak point in these systems. Microsoft 365 is objectively powerful, the Power Platform is incredibly capable, and tools like Copilot, SharePoint, and Teams create genuine possibilities for any business. You can retrieve data faster, summarize complex documents in seconds, and automate repetitive routing, which allows teams to collaborate much more effectively than older operating environments ever allowed. So when an AI or automation rollout begins, the early signals usually look very encouraging to the executive team. Leadership is engaged, the pilot group feels motivated by the potential, and the initial demos land well with everyone in the room. People can finally see the future of their workflow. And for a few weeks, the organization feels like it is actually moving toward a new era. Then the friction arrives, not because the tools stopped working, but because the design underneath them starts speaking a different language. A summary is useful, but the team is not sure whether the source was authoritative, and an automated flow works until the exception path becomes unclear to the person managing it. A recommendation might look plausible, but people still double-check the work manually because trust has not actually formed between the user and the system. Permissions surface old mistakes, site structures reveal inconsistent ownership, and while files certainly exist, nobody can say which one actually governs the next action. That is the internal pattern: strong tools, weak design. Once you see it, a lot of stalled adoption suddenly makes sense. Organizations expected AI consistency from an environment that was never structurally consistent to begin with, and that is the fundamental mismatch. The tool arrives with a promise of acceleration, but the operating model underneath is still fragmented across content, access, ownership, and decision flow. What the organization experiences is not transformation first, it experiences exposure. I've seen this in environments where the rollout itself was managed perfectly with good sponsorship, clear communications, and solid enablement. People were not resistant to the change, the business case made perfect sense, but the system still struggled because readiness was being measured at the product layer instead of the operating layer. We can deploy the tool, provision the access, and train the users, but those are not the only readiness questions that matter for long-term success. Can the organization identify authoritative sources, and can it explain why one library should ground action while another should be ignored? Can it connect permissions to actual business responsibility, or tell a user when an AI output is safe to act on versus when it is only a starting point? That is where things often break, and the result is usually very predictable for any seasoned architect. Output quality feels inconsistent, manual verification increases, and trust declines quietly until people stop using the official route for anything important. They don't stop because they hate the technology, they stop because the technology is revealing that the environment does not support reliable judgment at scale. That is why I think leaders sometimes misread what is happening in these rollouts when they see low adoption and assume the issue is just a lack of training. They see hesitation and assume the people need more prompting skills, and while that might be part of it, the larger truth is much more structural. The tools were ready before the operating model was. That is the sentence I would want every leadership team to sit with for a moment. It explains why technical capability and business confidence can diverge so sharply inside the same tenant. The platform can be mature, the features can be impressive, and the roadmap can be strong, yet the organization still cannot absorb the value cleanly because content design is inconsistent and decision paths remain blurry. From a system perspective, that is not a product problem. It is a design problem across the entire environment. If leaders respond to that by adding more tools without fixing the underlying design, they usually make the contradiction worse for the people on the ground. Now there are more outputs and more routes, which creates more places where people need to interpret, verify, and compensate manually just to get their jobs done. So the important diagnostic question is not whether Microsoft 365 has the right AI capability. The better question is whether we design this environment to support trusted action under AI conditions. If the answer is no, the pattern will repeat itself indefinitely. The tools will look strong, the business experience will feel weak, and eventually people will start bypassing the official path altogether. Shadow AI is a structural signal. And that is exactly why shadow AI starts showing up in the corners of the business. It doesn't happen because people are reckless by default or because policy suddenly stopped mattering to the workforce. Most of the time, shadow AI appears because the formal environment is no longer matching the speed, clarity, or usefulness that real work now demands. That distinction matters, because if leaders read shadow AI only as disobedience, they miss the diagnostic value of the behavior completely. People do not usually leave the official path when the official path works well enough for their daily needs. They leave when the sanctioned path feels slow, unclear, or disconnected from the work they are actually trying to complete. When someone copies content into an external tool or builds a workaround outside the governed environment, the first question should not be about who broke the rule. The first question should be, what was the rule-bound system failing to provide? The system is always telling you where it is failing, and shadow AI is one of the clearest signals you will ever get. It shows where friction is high, where decision support is weak, and where trust in official outputs has hit a breaking point. From a system perspective, unofficial tool use is often a form of structural compensation. The people inside the system still need speed and synthesis, and if the governed environment cannot deliver that, they will find another way to survive. That behavior is not random. It maps directly to specific design gaps in your infrastructure. Maybe the permission model is too messy for the official AI to be trusted, or perhaps the approved workflow is so slow that people switch to external tools just to keep moving. When the data sources inside Microsoft 365 are inconsistent, the polished interface still produces answers that people feel they have to verify manually. At that point, bypass behavior becomes predictable. It isn't good or safe, but it is predictable. Leaders need to be careful here because restriction without redesign usually makes the problem worse for everyone involved. If the business pressure remains the same and you simply ban the workaround without fixing the structural cause, the work does not disappear. It just becomes harder to see, leading to unmanaged duplication, private prompt habits, and even weaker oversight than you had before. The policy response alone is rarely enough. You need a design response that treats shadow AI as evidence. It is evidence that the formal operating model has lost practical legitimacy in some part of the workflow. A system may be officially approved and still fail to earn everyday trust, and when that happens, people root around it quietly at first and then at scale. I have seen this happen in environments where the stated goal was control, but the lived experience for users was nothing but friction and uncertainty. The organization built a compliant-looking surface, but underneath it, the real work started leaking elsewhere because the approved route didn't actually help. That is a fragile state because leadership thinks the system is governed while the actual behavior has already moved outside the boundary. So if shadow AI is showing up in your organization, I would not start by asking only how to shut it down. I would ask where the friction is highest, where the official AI is not trusted, and what people are trying to solve that the formal environment cannot support. Those answers will tell you far more about AI readiness than a usage dashboard ever could. Unauthorized use is not just a policy issue. It is feedback telling you where the organization has not yet earned the right to be the default environment for intelligent work. If you ignore that signal, the gap between official design and actual behavior will only keep widening. AI and organizational behavior. We need to talk about behavior without falling into the common trap of blaming people for simply adapting to the environment they were given. When AI enters an organization, it never meets a neutral workforce, but instead it slams into a complex web of existing habits and survival strategies. People bring their political memories, their local risk avoidance patterns, and the constant pressure of speed into every interaction with new technology. All of those existing forces shape what happens next. Yet when leaders see friction, they usually claim that people just aren't using the tools correctly. I always want to take one step back and ask what correctly even means in that specific environment. If you look closely at how employees interact with AI, you'll see their behavior isn't random or rebellious at all. It is a system outcome. People are incredibly fast at learning what gets rewarded, what creates personal risk, and what keeps them out of trouble with their boss. If the environment feels unclear, they will naturally optimize for self-protection, and if the system is slow, they will find a way to optimize for speed. This isn't a mindset issue or a lack of digital soul, but rather a perfectly logical adaptation to a badly aligned structure. Many organizations still treat AI adoption as a personality problem, assuming the people inside the system just need more enthusiasm or a better attitude. While a little more confidence helps, the deeper patterns are almost always structural because human behavior follows design pressure. If a team has spent years being punished for mistakes more than they've been rewarded for learning, they aren't going to use AI for creative exploration. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do, even if that's no longer what leadership wants from its AI investment. Think about how this looks in everyday work, like a sales team using AI to draft low-quality emails because the system only measures their response time. An operations team might double-check every single automated line because the cost of a mistake is too high for them to bear alone. Even middle managers might avoid official Copilot outputs because they don't want to carry the reputational risk if the machine hallucinates a fact. These aren't just annoying habits, but are actually loud structural signals that tell you exactly where your environment creates too much pressure or uncertainty. Leaders have to stop being behavior judges and start becoming better system observers. When you see a team hoarding knowledge or bypassing official tools, the answer isn't that one group is difficult while another is innovative. The truth is that the design conditions are different, and once you recognize those different incentives, your strategy for fixing it has to change. Instead of asking why they won't adopt the tool, you should start asking what specific risk they are managing locally. You need to find out what ambiguity they are compensating for and what the workflow actually punishes if they get a single detail wrong. Culture problems almost always sit right on top of design problems, which is why we often mistake an ownership issue for a lack of trust. We call it resistance, but often it's just an exception handling issue where the tool doesn't account for the messy reality of the job. Behavior only becomes durable and consistent when the environment keeps reproducing it every single day. If leaders want to see a different kind of AI behavior, they have to redesign the environment that is currently generating the old one. This means creating clearer decision rights, establishing source authority, and making it safe for people to escalate a problem when the AI fails. You don't shift behavior through slogans or top-down pressure, but through intentional design that makes the new way of working the path of least resistance. Human roles versus system roles. Once we start redesigning the environment, we run into the unavoidable question of what people should still do and what the system should carry for them. Most AI conversations get trapped in a binary frame of either replacing people or protecting them, which isn't helpful for building a functional operating model. The better way to look at this is through role clarity, focusing not on human versus machine, but on the human role versus the system role. This is a design problem where we look at which parts of the process require a person and which parts are better handled by infrastructure. From a system perspective, human roles are strongest where the context is messy, the stakes are uneven, and judgment has to go beyond simple pattern recognition. System roles are strongest where the work is repeatable, retrieval-heavy, and can be structurally defined by a set of rules. The system is excellent at retrieving relevant content and comparing large volumes of material, but it lacks the authority to own the outcome. It can draft first versions and flag anomalies all day, but usefulness is not the same thing as accountability. The human role matters most, where meaning has to be negotiated and where trade-offs have to be owned by someone who understands the consequences. I define the human side of the equation as moving toward judgment, exception handling, and relationship management. This isn't a soft or feel-good statement, but an architectural one about how we distribute labor effectively. If you leave humans doing retrieval and repetition while expecting machines to handle ambiguous judgment, you have designed a system that is fundamentally backwards. You are currently spending expensive human capacity on machine-suitable work while giving tasks that require accountable interpretation to a statistical model. If someone is spending their entire day searching across Teams, SharePoint, and old email threads just to find basic context, that is a system failure. Retrieval and synthesis should move into the system role so that the person can focus on what that information actually means for the business. When source signals conflict or a recommendation crosses a high financial threshold, the human role becomes more valuable, not less. Organizations often get confused and think that AI maturity means reducing human involvement across the board, but that isn't the goal. True maturity means concentrating human involvement where it actually matters, resulting in fewer people chasing files and more people arbitrating meaning. We need fewer humans acting as manual glue between disconnected databases and more humans deciding what a weak signal means in a high-stakes moment. Unclear boundaries create a dangerous kind of friction where nobody knows who was supposed to verify the data or stop the flow. Once human and system roles blur together, responsibility blurs with them, and that role confusion becomes a new form of structural fragility. To fix this, you can take any workflow and mark every single step as either system-led, human-led, or human-over-system exception handling. If you can't categorize your steps that clearly, then your workflow isn't actually ready for AI at scale. The goal is a better division of labor under real business conditions, but that only works when the information backbone is more aligned than what we see today. The single source of truth, properly understood. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood concepts in the modern workplace, which is the idea of a single source of truth. When leaders hear that phrase, they usually picture one giant repository or a final cleanup project that ends duplication forever, but that mental model is actually less useful under the pressure of AI. A single source of truth is not really about a specific storage location because it is actually about creating one trusted decision reality for the entire organization. In any real business, information will always live across multiple systems like SharePoint, Teams, and Excel, and trying to collapse all of that into one container is not a serious architectural goal. The objective is not total centralization, but rather reducing the contradictory versions of truth that pull people in different directions. People do not lose trust because you have multiple systems. They lose trust when those systems make competing claims about what is actually happening. One file says one thing while an email says another, and suddenly the spreadsheet has different numbers than the team channel, which means the problem is no longer about storage. This creates decision instability that AI makes much more visible because the software will retrieve and summarize whatever it finds without resolving the contradictions for you. You have to understand the single source of truth as an authority model rather than a physical place, which means defining exactly what counts as authoritative for any given action. In Microsoft 365, this becomes practical very quickly when you explicitly designate certain sites or libraries as the official record for the company. Naming conventions must carry actual meaning instead of just being convenient for the person saving the file, and labels or ownership should help the system distinguish between a rough draft and decision-grade content. Trust rises when the organization can answer the simple question of where an answer is supposed to come from, because without that clarity, every retrieval becomes a debate that destroys decision speed. Leaders need to stop treating this as a giant cleanup exercise and start framing it as a quest for one trusted decision reality. This structural resilience rests on clear source designation, consistent metadata, and named ownership that prevents unofficial copies from becoming operational truth by accident. Many organizations get tripped up here because they think a document existing in SharePoint solves the problem, but discoverability is not the same as authority. If authoritative truth is weak, then AI retrieval gets noisy, confidence drops, and humans start rebuilding certainty manually until all the promised speed disappears. The real objective is a stable answer to a single question. For this specific decision, what source is supposed to govern our reality? Once that becomes clear, everything else starts tightening around it and permissions become more rational while ownership becomes more visible to everyone. AI outputs are much easier to trust when they are grounded in something the organization has already agreed is real, and once that truth is stable, actual speed becomes possible. Decision velocity depends on structural clarity. Once truth becomes stable, we can finally talk about speed in a way that actually matters for the business. A lot of leadership teams talk about faster decision-making as if it comes from pressure or better dashboards, but it usually comes from structural clarity instead. More tools and more reporting do not automatically create faster decisions, and in many organizations, adding AI actually does the opposite by increasing input volume without improving the logic of the system. The business ends up with more visibility but less movement, which might feel modern on the surface, but structurally it remains slow. Decision delay rarely begins with a lack of information, and it usually starts with unclear authority, unclear evidence, or an unclear path for escalation. If nobody knows who is allowed to decide, or if nobody trusts the source of the data, the choice stalls regardless of how much technology you have. AI only makes this pattern more obvious because it removes time from analysis much faster than most organizations can remove ambiguity from human judgment. A Copilot summary might arrive in seconds, yet the meeting still ends with a request to validate the data first, because the structural trust isn't there. A dashboard might update in real time, but the decision still waits for a human to confirm which specific number actually counts for the quarterly goal. This is not a speed problem at the tool layer, it is a clarity problem at the structure layer. Because decision velocity is always a product of alignment. You need aligned data and aligned authority to move with less drama, which allows people to act without needing five-side conversations to establish who is allowed to move. Real speed comes from removing the need to create extra meetings just to convert uncertainty into permission. Many leaders try to solve slow decisions by adding more information, but if the underlying architecture is unclear, each new input just creates another opportunity for disagreement. What looks like decision support often becomes decision load, which is one of the most expensive misunderstandings in modern knowledge work today. Leaders assume delay comes from a lack of intelligence, but it usually comes from a lack of structural clarity around that intelligence. If your digital estate is full of useful context, but nobody knows who owns the outcome or who can challenge a recommendation, the system becomes a sophisticated hesitation machine. To improve decision velocity, you shouldn't ask how to make people move faster, but rather what part of the decision is still structurally unclear. Is the owner unclear, or is the risk threshold still a mystery to the people doing the work? Clarity is what lowers the cost of judgment. And once that cost drops, AI becomes much more valuable because the organization can finally convert saved time into action. Without that clarity, saved time just becomes more waiting in a nicer interface. So an AI-first organization is simply one that knows what is true and who decides. The 5 elements of an AI-first organization. So what does an AI-first organization actually look like when you pull back the curtain? I'm not talking about the polished slides in a marketing deck or the high-energy promises of a vendor keynote. I'm talking about the hard reality of your daily operations. If we strip away the noise, the entire transition comes down to 5 specific elements. I prefer reducing it to these 5 because executives don't need another maturity model with 50 different boxes to check. They need a structural test they can actually use to see if their foundation is holding up. The The first element is a single source of truth, but we have to understand what that really means. It isn't about building one giant magical repository for every file you own. It's about creating one trusted decision reality. This means the organization can point to a specific source and say that for this type of question, this is the data that governs our action. The system needs to know which content is authoritative, which data is current, and which records are ready for a high-stakes decision versus what is just a rough draft. Without that clarity, AI has nothing stable to ground itself in. It will still produce outputs, but the business will keep paying a verification tax because the truth remains unstable and hard to find. The second element is a clear ownership model. Every important asset in your digital environment needs a named owner. And I don't mean a committee or a vague stakeholder group. You need a real person who is personally accountable for the quality of the content, the logic of who gets access, and the integrity of the process. This includes your data assets, your workflow stages, and your high-value knowledge spaces. Ownership gives the organization a place to land when quality drops or a risk appears. Without a clear owner, AI creates a massive amount of shared exposure without any shared control, and that is a system that simply does not scale. The third element is a defined decision flow. This is where many organizations stay far too vague for their own good. They might understand the general process, but they haven't mapped out the actual judgment path. An AI-first organization makes that path visible by defining who decides what, which evidence they use, and what the threshold for action is. We also need to know what happens when confidence is low or when different signals start to conflict with each other. That clarity is what turns AI from a clever assistant into a usable operating capability. Once the decision flow is explicit, the AI can participate without blurring who is actually responsible for the outcome. The system supports the work, the human makes the call, and everyone understands exactly where one ends and the other begins. The fourth element is permission alignment. In a professional environment, access must reflect responsibility. This is one of the clearest design signals you'll see in a Microsoft environment today. If people can see things they shouldn't, or if they can't reach the tools they need to do their jobs, your operating model is already out of alignment. In an AI context, that friction gets amplified because Copilot and agents will surface whatever the environment permits them to see. Permission design isn't just a boring security matter. It's an operating statement about who is trusted to know and who is expected to act. Clean permission logic lowers your risk, but it also builds trust because people finally understand the boundaries of the system they are working in. The fifth element is continuous system feedback. This is where AI-first organizations separate themselves from the one-and-done rollout mentality. They don't assume the design is finished just because the software is live. Instead, they constantly measure whether the operating model is actually producing better outcomes for the business. They ask if decision speed is improving, if rework is falling, and if people are starting to trust the outputs more than they did last month. That feedback loop is vital because while AI technology changes fast, organizational drift happens quietly in the background. If you aren't measuring the structure itself, you'll only notice the failure after the trust has already evaporated. When you put those 5 elements together, the picture becomes very clear. You have one trusted decision reality and named ownership. You have a defined decision flow with permissions aligned to actual responsibility. Finally, you have a continuous feedback loop on quality, trust, and speed. That is what an AI-first organization looks like. It isn't the company with the most licenses or the one using the loudest innovation language. It's the one with enough structural clarity to absorb intelligence without breaking. Most companies don't fail at AI because they lack ambition. They fail because of poor design. They try to scale intelligence across an environment where truth is contested, ownership is vague, and authority is blurry. From a system perspective, that isn't a strategy. It's just structural compensation for a broken foundation. If you are leading this work, I would make these 5 elements visible as fast as possible, put them on a single page and audit them with total honesty. Ask where the truth is still being fought over and where ownership has become purely ceremonial. Look for the places where decisions still depend on side conversations and where permissions no longer match the reality of the business. If you make those gaps visible, you aren't just getting ready for AI, you are improving the fundamental reality of how your business functions. A 90-day measurement model for leaders. This is the point where strategy has to become observable. If AI readiness stays at the level of vision statements and general enthusiasm, most organizations are going to overestimate how much progress they've actually made. They will confuse a flurry of activity with real structural change. Licenses will get assigned and pilots will multiply, but underneath the surface, the operating model might still be producing the same old delays and uncertainty. If you are the one leading this, don't start by asking if adoption is going up. Ask if the organization is becoming easier to make decisions inside. That is the only measurement shift that matters. For the first 90 days, leaders need a simple model rather than a giant, complicated transformation dashboard. You only need 4 signals to tell you if your operating model is becoming more usable. The first signal is decision velocity. We need to know how long it takes to move from a meaningful input to a real final decision. I'm not talking about how fast an email gets turned into a workflow. I'm talking about the time between a customer issue appearing and someone with authority making the call. That number is critical because AI can compress analysis in seconds, but if the decision time doesn't move, the bottleneck was never the data, it was the structure of the organization itself. The second signal is decision clarity. What percentage of your important decisions can be traced back to a clear owner and a trusted data source? This is one of the strongest tests you can run on your system. If the answer is fuzzy, your speed will always be fragile because every decision still requires people to manually reconstruct trust from scratch. I would measure this by sampling real decisions and asking if the ownership was explicit before the decision even happened. The third signal is rework reduction. We have to track how often outputs are being revised, reversed, or manually rebuilt after the fact. Rework is the place where structural ambiguity becomes incredibly expensive for a company. If your AI summaries still need heavy manual repair, or if approvals are constantly being reopened, then the system isn't creating throughput. It's just creating a new form of manual work with a more modern interface. Rework will always tell you the truth faster than adoption metrics ever could. The fourth signal is the AI trust signal. This one is simple. How often do your people feel they must manually verify an AI output before they can use it? Verification is healthy in high-risk spots, but if every single output requires a manual check regardless of the risk, then trust hasn't actually formed. If trust hasn't formed, the value of the system will stall out. You want to see teams starting to rely on outputs for low-risk tasks while they save their energy for challenging the high-risk cases. These 4 signals work together to give you a full picture. Velocity tells you if action is speeding up, while clarity tells you if the structure behind that action is getting stronger. Rework reduction shows you if uncertainty is shrinking, and the trust signal tells you if people actually view the system as usable. That is more than enough to focus on for the first 90 days. I like this model because it keeps leaders focused on the reality of the business instead of vanity metrics. We don't need to obsess over login counts or how many people attended a training session. Those things are secondary to the primary question: is the organization becoming structurally easier to operate? If I were setting this up today, I would choose a few high-friction workflows like approvals or forecasting. Baseline those 4 measures now before the next wave of the rollout hits. Readiness isn't a vague statement you make in a meeting. It's a measurable pattern in your data. Once you can see that pattern, you can stop arguing about abstractions and start making real decisions based on evidence. What leaders need to stop doing. If we accept that measurement model as our foundation, the next step is going to feel uncomfortable, but it is absolutely necessary for any real progress. Leaders have to stop doing a few things that look responsible on the surface while they actually keep the organization structurally stuck in the past. The first habit to break is treating governance like a one-time gate that you simply pass through. Many leadership teams still approach AI the same way they handled old enterprise software rollouts, where they finish the review, pass the controls, and then publish a policy before moving on. They act as if the environment is now permanently governed, but AI does not behave like a static deployment because the data, the prompts, and the business pressures are constantly shifting. Governance has to live within that movement, and if it only appears at the very beginning of a project, you aren't actually practicing governance, you are just performing theater. The second thing to stop is buying expensive digital tools to compensate for structural ambiguity within your teams. This happens all the time when decision-making feels slow, so the leadership answer is to build another dashboard, or knowledge feels fragmented, so they buy another AI assistant. If the underlying problem is actually unclear authority or a lack of a single source of truth, then adding more tooling just increases the surface area of confusion. The organization might feel busier because of the new tech, but it never actually becomes clearer for the people doing the work. And why is that? It's because technology can scale existing clarity, but it is fundamentally unable to create clarity out of nothing. If the business has not defined who decides, what counts as a trusted input, and how exceptions move through the chain, then the new tool just inherits the same old disorder in a much more expensive form. The third thing leaders need to stop doing is reading low adoption rates as a training problem by default. While some training gaps are real and people certainly need help and examples to build confidence, low adoption is often misdiagnosed because training is the least threatening explanation for failure. It allows leadership to assume the structure is sound and the people just need to catch up, but many times the exact opposite is true. The people inside the system are usually reacting quite rationally to weak source quality, vague ownership, or outputs they simply do not trust enough to use without checking everything manually. That is not a learning gap first, it is a design gap. If you try to solve a design gap with more enablement alone, you are just teaching your people how to live inside a flawed environment more efficiently. The fourth thing to stop is separating the technical rollout from the redesign of your operating model. This is probably the biggest mistake I see, because if IT is deploying Copilot while the business keeps running the same vague decision structures underneath, You haven't created an AI-first organization. You have simply added intelligence to an old, rigid operating model and hoped the tension would somehow disappear on its own. It won't, because AI cuts across boundaries that the old model kept separate, like content quality, access logic, and risk ownership. These elements now affect each other in real time, so the rollout cannot live in a technical lane while the operating model stays untouched in another. Finally, the fifth thing leaders must stop doing is asking whether the AI works before asking if the organization is aligned enough to actually use it. That sounds like a subtle distinction, but it changes everything about your strategy. When a leadership team asks if the AI works, they usually just mean, does the tool produce a useful output? Which is far too small a question. The more important question is whether your organization can absorb that output without turning it into more delay, more rework, or more unmanaged risk. If I was speaking directly to leaders, I would put it very simply. Stop looking for structural compensation. Stop trying to buy your way around ambiguity, and stop blaming hesitation on the people inside the system before you inspect the design of the system itself. You have to stop confusing a technical deployment with true organizational readiness. Once AI pressure enters the building, every design weakness becomes more visible and more expensive, which means the real executive question is now impossible to avoid. The executive choice under AI pressure. This brings us to the ultimate executive choice under AI pressure, and it isn't a question of whether or not to adopt the technology. That question is already behind us. The real choice is whether you will keep scaling a fragmented operating model or whether you will redesign the business so intelligence can move through it without multiplying confusion. That is the only decision that matters, because being AI first is not about being the first to deploy a new feature. It is about being able to absorb intelligence safely. Some organizations will look fast because they bought licenses early and launched a pilot, but speed at the point of deployment is not the same thing as structural readiness. In many cases, the companies that look slower on the surface are actually building a much stronger foundation underneath. And why is that? It's because the organizations that benefit most from AI are usually not the ones with the most features, but the ones with the clearest truth and ownership models. That is what actually compounds over time. If the operating model stays fragmented, AI just scales that confusion faster and makes contradictions easier to surface. It makes weak permissions more dangerous and decision delays more expensive than they ever were before. But if decision rights become clear and source authority becomes stable, then AI becomes something very different for the business. It becomes a compounding capability, not because the model got smarter overnight, but because the business became more absorbent. That is the word I would leave leaders with: absorbent. Can your organization absorb intelligence without breaking trust, slowing down judgment, or increasing your unmanaged risk? If the answer is no, then what you need is not another wave of AI enthusiasm or a new set of prompts. You need an operating model redesign. This is why this moment matters so much, as AI is forcing leadership teams to choose between two very different paths. You can choose structural resilience, or you can choose structural compensation. One path says we will make the environment clearer and more decision-ready, while the other path says we will keep layering tools on top of ambiguity and hope the performance improves. Only one of those paths actually scales. If you audited your structural resilience the same way you audit your quarterly earnings, what would you find? Is your system designed to sustain your growth, or is it slowly draining your capacity to compete? The biggest barrier to AI isn't the model, the license, or the interface, but rather the operating model you built long before this technology even arrived. If this perspective gave you a clearer lens, leave a review or connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn to send over the next system question you want me to unpack.